So what we'll hopefully cover today in the about 45 minutes that we have is I'm going to talk a little bit about the communicator and the audience and how to bridge the gap between the two, getting to know your audience and how this can be achieved, how to best prepare for a talk if you have no idea who will be attending it. Very different from sort of a teaching environment in a school class where you know who the people are you're going to be talking to, or if you're presenting at a scientific conference, you kind of have this very, very specific knowledge of who your audience is going to be. Whereas if you're just doing a drop-in event, you have no idea. Can you even prepare for that? What are some ideas there? How to deal with groups which are very diverse regarding things like age or prior knowledge or cultural background. How you can turn your audience into your allies rather than kind of being shell-shocked by them and a little bit afraid. And some theory around the importance of active listening. So the communicator, it's going to be very, very jellyfish based visually, because I didn't have time to change the template anymore. But I think the jellyfish are very, very pretty and sort of calming to look at. So it's maybe not a bad thing. So the communicator and the audience. First of all, starting off with yourself, it's really important, I think, to be clear about how you see yourself, be clear about your role, be clear about what you are comfortable with. Because the most important thing as a communicator, if you're standing in front of a group, and this also to a degree applies for doing online communication. So even though if you're posting on Instagram or if you're presenting remotely, you are less, in a way, you're less there as a person, but it's still you, the person who is creating the presentation. So there's still going to be a lot of you in that presentation. And I think the most important thing there is to be genuine, to be yourself, not to try to kind of put on a teacher persona that isn't you, but that is something that you think you should be, because that is something that audiences can smell. And especially having worked a lot with teenagers can smell that extremely much, that they just know when you're not being honest, when you're trying to put on a show. So that is really the one thing. Really know what you're comfortable with. And if you're not comfortable with doing the big song and dance routine, then don't feel like you're somehow deficient. Then you have other qualities, but just go with whatever you feel is something where you can shine, where you can really be relaxed and not somehow feel uncomfortable about the persona you're trying to be. Also, be aware that while you may have the specific knowledge that the audience currently presumably lacks and which you want to transmit, the same is also true the other way around. The audience is going to have some knowledge that you don't have, because if you think about it, both the communicator and the audience know stuff, want to share knowledge. So often when you have an audience coming out to an event, they will come with some kind of knowledge, maybe local knowledge or some very specific knowledge about one of the aspects you'll talk about, and they'll be eager to share that, just as eager as you are to share your knowledge. Both of you have knowledge gaps because no one ever knows everything. Both are maybe quite apprehensive about the situation. So you are kind of like, oh, I hope they're going to like me. I hope they're going to be responsive. And the audience is maybe like, I hope it's going to be interesting. I hope it's not going to be another one of these boring lecture type things. And both of you have certain preset opinions. This can apply to your value systems, but it can also apply to how you see other people and what you expect of each other. So overall, you're not that different from each other. So that perceived huge gap, that's this, the role of one being the communicator and the other one being the audience, there's more of a perceived gap than like a real gap very often. And it helps to make yourself aware of that. Then, first impressions. So what do you think? And I'm going to ask you to just unmute yourself and shout it in if you have an idea. What are things that can form a first impression? You come into the room, there you are, there's your audience, or you come into the group situation. What are things for you that you think form a first impression?
Body language.
Body language, yeah.
Smile.
Yes, absolutely.
Eye
Body language.
contact.
Eye contact, yes, exactly. That's gonna already shows how open people are or how withdrawn they are. Yeah.
Preparedness. You can tell if someone's sort of fumbling.
Yes, exactly. Like this typical speaker who goes up to the podium and then starts sort of messing about with his papers and everything. And yeah. So some things that I came up with when I was brainstorming yesterday was clothing. That can be, it's a very superficial thing, but that can totally be a first impression. So if you come somewhere and everything is like super formal and people are wearing suits and everything, it's going to convey a different feeling than if people are very casually dressed. Also, if the clothes seem to be expensive or rather not, so if someone seems somehow a bit scruffy, all that is going to influence our perception of the situation, and it's also really going to influence our own comfort. Because, for example, if I come in somewhere and I just look like some casual dude and then everyone in my audience is wearing suits, I'm going to really perceive a huge gap between them and myself. Whereas if everyone kind of looks casual and relaxed, then this gap isn't going to be, this perceived gap isn't going to be as large. And that would sort of relate to this level of formality, like how stiff is a situation or how casual is a situation. Age, I think, is an important first impression. If we don't know who we're going to be talking to and we come into the room and we see that it's predominantly teenagers, then we might be like, oh my God, I'm gonna have to talk to teenagers. This is awful. Or if it's predominantly elderly people, you might have a preconception then about, oh, I'm going to have to behave in a certain way because this is these are elderly people and somehow this is going to influence the way that I interact with them. So age comes with a lot of preconceptions in our head. Or gender, if we come into a group and it's predominantly men, we might feel like, I hope that's not going to be like a bunch of mansplainers now who are just going to waffle on about their own special topics that they think they're really knowledgeable about. If it's a group of young women, maybe we think like, oh, this is going to be like nice and relaxed because everyone's going to be more friendly. I don't know, whatever we have in our heads can then again influence the way that we deal with this group. So first impressions are really going to sort of try to force us down a certain avenue of thinking, which means that we have to stop and reflect and ask ourselves, are there certain stigmas attached to any of these first impressions? Like if someone's not smiling, do we straight away assume this person is somehow unfriendly or is going to be really grumpy all the time and ask us mean questions? Or do we just think, oh, maybe that person is also just shy, or maybe just happened not to smile in that moment for no bigger reason? Try to sort of go onto this meta level and try not to let yourself be drawn into a certain avenue of thinking within your preconceptions. Also, if you think there's a certain stigma attached to yourself, try to address it. Like, for example, if you are an older white man who enjoys wearing suits and you come into a group of young adults who are all dressed really like alternatively casually, then how do you address that initial gap between you and them that everyone will sort of feel like it's the elephant in the room? Like, and what always is a really good thing to do, I think, is to reveal something about yourself, to make it personal. Because if you start revealing a little bit about yourself, like what you're passionate about, what your story is, you kind of turn yourself from that first impression and that maybe that sort of cardboard cutout into a real person. And then once you make it more personal, people are going to perceive more of you and not just these first superficial impressions. And also ask your audience who they are, why they are there, what they know. Try never to assume anything based on first impressions, even though first impressions are helpful to sort of get a first feel of the audience. They shouldn't determine entirely what you think of them. If the group is small, you can take the time like what we did in the beginning to let everyone speak who wants to and introduce themselves. If the group is larger, you may need to do a show of hand type thing, like who's been in this area before, who's got prior knowledge, just so that's something to previously think about, what you do with a small group versus what you do with a larger group, because you sometimes might not even know how large the group is going to be. But it's definitely a good idea to really try to get to know each other before the presentation, because that turns you into people rather than just into images. So that is, again, it's just important, like I said, reveal something about yourself. Why are you passionate about your topic? Turn yourself into a person. Talk a little bit about your life journey. By all means, don't waffle on for 15 minutes, but just let people know what's important to you. See if there's any initial common ground with your audience. Like, I'm also from this area, or I grew up here, I went here a lot when I was a child, or the area where I live is also affected by coastal erosion, or just something that makes people kind of connect to you on this level of, oh, we have something in common, because commonalities are very helpful when you're trying to build a relationship with an audience. And just let them know that scientists are people too, because we need to sometimes demystify the role of science and of scientists. And it's really, I think, especially small group events are a great way of doing that and of really getting down to that personal level of communication, rather than sort of the scientist being up on his little podium as almost like this ethereal person who has all this knowledge that has been bestowed upon them, and now they're kind of spreading it out like some kind of profit. So I think that's really important. Scientists are just people who learned about stuff and who are now going to talk to other people about what they know. And it's going to be sort of a give and take with the group. And with the audience, like I said, invite everyone to introduce themselves. And according to the size of the group, you might have to be a bit flexible there. Find out if they're local to the area. If you're talking about something that's specifically local, they might be just there as tourists and drop into your event and have no idea about the area, but they might have lived there all their lives. So that's interesting to know for later if you're leading people around on an actual outdoor walk, because they can become your allies if they have a lot of local knowledge. You might be able to pick their brains a little bit on certain things. What do they do? Are they maybe environmental professionals, or do they do something that's completely unrelated to anything to do with the environment? That can be quite interesting, also to get different viewpoints on topics. Find out what they expect, if that suits you, if you're kind of comfortable with sort of asking people's expectations. It's not something that every presenter is going to be comfortable with, because it can sort of put you under pressure to try and fulfill everyone's expectations. But you could ask them, what do they expect? And you could ask them what really annoys them when listening to presentations. But of course, with that, you kind of put yourself on the spot a little bit. So again, it comes down to what you yourself are comfortable with. But these are just some ideas how you could, before you actually start your presentation, how you could interact with your audience. Moving on to the preparations for all of this. So how is it even possible to prepare for a presentation where you don't know what your audience is going to be like? If we assume now we're putting on an event, we're like what we do with the Plover Rovers, a guided walk along part of the coast path, and we want to talk about seagrass meadows because there are some seagrass meadows there. And we have no idea if it's going to be a group of people with a lot of previous knowledge about seagrass, and they just saw that, oh, there's something about seagrass on, I go to everything that has seagrass in it. So that's why I'm going to attend, but they actually probably know just as much as you do, or even more. Or if it's going to be just a bunch of random families who were at the beach and saw there's something going on and now are just dropping in. Is it going to be grandparents with their grandchildren? So you've got everything from a 70-year-old to a 6-year-old. Or is it going to be a group of students from a local college that are doing biology A levels and saw that there's something going on? So you have no idea. So how do you even prepare for that? It's quite daunting sometimes. And it's really important to remember to build it up slowly and start with the basics. So you do need to be broadly prepared. Don't be tempted to treat it like a scientific conference and be really specific about something where only maybe one or two of your group will be able to follow, and everyone else is kind of dropping out, thinking like, oh, this is very specific now. I don't even really know what seagrass is, so I don't really understand what's being talked about here. And be aware of that the time that you have is limited. So if you've been doing your PhD research for 3 years on seagrass meadows, you're not going to be able to convey that in 40 minutes anyway. Be clear about what your learning goals are. So it is helpful to kind of in your head know, okay, I have this minimum learning goal that once I'm done with the group, I want them to know that there are seagrass meadows here. I want them to know why seagrass meadows are important. And I want them to know what the threats are and what they can maybe do in order to help with seagrass conservation. And anything else is a bonus. If I can teach them any more about like specific species living there, or about a little bit more complex dynamics within the seagrass meadows or whatever, that's great. But be sure to formulate some basic learning goals, because that's going to feel like you've achieved something. Otherwise, you kind of go out of the situation and it's kind of like a little bit fluffy, and you think like, did I really bring across what I wanted to bring across? And did these people really take the takeaway points that I kind of wanted them to take away? So be clear in these learning goals, but be very, very flexible on how you're going to bring things across, and also be prepared to maybe having to drop one of these learning goals if you just have the feeling you're not going to get there. So this is very, very different, especially for people who are used to presenting in front of scientific audiences at conferences, where you really plan your presentation. You have your 40 slides and they're all numbered and they're all like building on each other, and it's super like small steps that all depend on one another. So then of course it can be very daunting if you have nothing like that. If you just go in there with a very broad idea and you don't have this step-by-step thing you can kind of like a handrail just grab and go along. But that's just something that comes with the dynamic, and which is also the beauty of the dynamic of really communicating rather than just presenting at an audience. Flexibility is absolutely the key. And you do get used to it. It is a bit stressful sometimes, but if you're being honest, and if you also admit if you don't know something, or if a question you get goes in a direction where you really say, I don't know, I'm not an expert in that field, then just say that, and people will accept it, because scientists are people too, as we learned earlier. And plan with asking your audience for help. Like I said, for example, if you do have local people, you can ask them about local specifics. You can have, if you discover you have someone in the group who's an expert on seabirds or whatever, you can ask her if there's a special connection between the seabirds and the seagrass meadows, whatever the case may be. I want to just elaborate on that a little more, because I think that's something that we all as presenters are a little bit afraid of, the expert in the group. Because it is great to turn them into your allies and your helper, but of course there's always the danger of them hijacking your talk. That's something you don't want to happen. So first thing is, try not to fight them though. If you do have someone who's an expert in an area and who keeps wanting to sort of drop their knowledge into your talk, it is overall a smoother experience if you let them do that, and let them have the feeling that they're participating and sharing their knowledge, than if you're trying to shut them down and fight them all the time. However, if they do end up hijacking your talk, what's worked quite well in my experience is if you try to offer them a more appropriate space later. So for example, you could say something, oh, that's a very interesting point, but I still want to touch on a couple of other things. I would be super happy to chat about this with you afterwards, and like have you enlighten me on that. And if anyone else wants to stick around for that, they're very welcome to. But now I'd just like to move on to the next point I still wanted to cover. So that is quite good. You do run into a bit more profound problems if the self-proclaimed experts actually are not really very good experts, but they basically just think they're experts, but they're talking a lot of crap. And you know that because you know more than them, and you kind of think like they're just repeating some kind of popular belief that, and they think that's the truth, but it's actually not. So then, of course, you can't say, oh, that's a really important point, because it's maybe just isn't. So then sometimes it helps to just kind of nod and smile and kind of go over it and just go on with your own thing. It very much depends on the topic. It always is quite advisable if you're talking about a bit of a controversial topic, like, for example, natural coastal defenses, say, where there's a lot of like public opinion that goes in different directions. It helps to know the common arguments, and it also helps to know the common misconceptions that people might have, because that's something that they might bring up as facts. And then you can say, well, that is one opinion, but actually the research shows that blah, 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 whatever. So it does, that would sort of belong to that broad preparation that I was talking about, that you kind of know how to answer to things where someone in the group might just perceive that as the only truth, but it's actually not. The last thing that I wanted to touch on here is sort of the mansplaining alpha male type in the group. And there also, if you think on a psychology level, what these mostly men need is that they need to assert their position, and otherwise they feel really uncomfortable and insecure. So it really helps to say like, yes, that's a very important point. Thank you. You smile at them, nod, and because they need that reassurance that they have asserted themselves as a knowledgeable person now. And if they feel they're being taken seriously, they will usually then let you just get on with it. And if you kind of shut them down and don't acknowledge them, they just feel like they have to keep asserting themselves and inserting themselves into your presentation until you've acknowledged that, like, yes, you can see that they're like a knowledgeable person. So I think that's a lot of the anxieties of presenting in front of an unknown group result from people like that, who where you have, as a presenter, you have the feeling like they're calling you out, or they're challenging you, or they're somehow fighting with you for that top position. But it's just because they just need to have that nod and that smile and saying like, yes, you're that's an important point you're making, thank you. And often that works. Then I'd like to go on to the question of homogeneous groups. Of course, we all like to speak in front of a homogeneous group, because that way we know that we've understood, we've gotten to know our group, we understand what they expect, and then we can just have our presentation that is tailored towards their needs. So if it's a bunch of retired university professors, you're going to have very sort of scientific level. If it's a bunch of school children, you're going to deal more with on a childlike sort of level with them. But with these drop-in events like we're having with the Plover Rovers, which are just essentially open events, that probably won't happen. We're probably always going to be dealing with a very diverse crowd. And also, of course, if you're doing communication through platforms like Instagram, you never know who's going to actually see what you're posting. So you'd probably be interested in kind of doing something to engage with everyone. So first of all, when you are getting to know your group, watch out for marked differences in age or level of prior knowledge or cultural background, although the cultural background is a tricky one. I'll come to that in a second. Then use these differences to make your presentation more lively and engage your audience, because these really diverse groups can actually make for really exciting and entertaining presentations if you manage to use the differences rather than kind of perceive them as something that's a huge problem, because now your presentation is only going to make 50% of the group happy and the other 50% is going to end up being bored. Some ideas what you could do, if you're looking at age, for example, you can try to kind of build connections between the age groups. So you could ask older members of the group if the place has changed a lot from when they were the age of the youngest member of the group. You could ask young members of the group what they think might change in the future once they reach the age of the oldest member of the group. So you can try to build these connections between them by looking at memories and future predictions. You can, as we said before, if you have people with a lot of local knowledge or prior knowledge on the topic, you can ask them to share their knowledge. But there it's really important to also really encourage the people who have said that they have no prior knowledge to ask any questions that they need to ask, to really make clear that they're not in some way deficient because they're not the ones with prior knowledge, that they're really the target of this presentation, that it's not a problem. Even if there are two people who say they have no prior knowledge and everyone else does, it does not mean that these two people are now somehow just have sort of pulled the short straw and are the ones that are not being targeted anymore. So it's really important that they are not too shy to ask whatever they need to ask. You can do things like if you give a bit of a more sort of high-level lecture type information to the keen grandparents, the keen birders that you have there, you can encourage the kids to meanwhile pick up a shell where you're standing and examine it closely, and then afterwards share what they found exciting about the shell, what they've noticed. You can do things like have them pick up a handful of sand or mud where you're standing and kind of rub it in their hands and do a soil analysis. Like, is it sandy? Is it muddy? Is it pebbly? And afterwards you can tell them that's exactly what we're doing as scientists when we're doing soil analysis, where we're looking, is this like sandy mud or muddy sand or pebbly sand? And then they've done science while they were standing there and the grown-ups were talking. Or you can see how many pieces of litter can you find until I've finished my little presentation. This all needs, of course, a little bit of supervision because you can't just let them run off from the group. But these things are all things that they can do while they're literally standing with the group without moving from the spot. And most of the time, you will always have a bunch of grown-ups who can have an eye on the kids. So, of course, supervision is always a concern when you have kids in the group anyway. You have to keep them from running off and falling into the rock pools and all that. But there are ways to kind of cater to both age groups if you just kind of try to use what's around you. And then the question of culture, that's a tricky one because, again, it's kind of first impressions and people might look like they're from another culture, but maybe they're actually not. And then it would be really awkward if you're kind of like, so what's it like where you guys come from? And it's like, well, in Sheffield, we and you thought they were maybe from somewhere abroad or whatever because of what they looked like. It is something, I mean, it seems obvious not to make these assumptions, but it's something that happens a lot. And I've worked a lot with multicultural groups, and I've just heard a lot of stories from people who that happened to, who were basically singled out in a group because of the way they looked, because mainly it was a group of white academics and they were the only brown person. And then people were just somehow assuming they're from a different culture, even though they were like from central London. So it does happen, and it's important that we don't fall into that trap. But of course, it's also a pity if there are actually people in the group who do come from a different culture, if we kind of don't use that to get a different viewpoint in. So you can just ask very open questions. Like, say, if you were talking about how people are using blue spaces, you could then ask if anyone in the group wants to share a different point of view. For example, how certain communities usually use blue spaces. So that way, anyone who would like to share a different point of view or who feels that their point of view differs a lot from the point of view that you have presented, they can speak up. And this could be like a different culture, it could be a different class, or it could be just a different area where they're from. And they can share that if they want to, but at the same time, you're not putting anyone on the spot and kind of saying like, you look like you're not from here. What do you people do at the coast? Because that's obviously not what you would want to do. And lastly, try to offer something for everyone, but don't panic if you can't, because you're, in the end, scientists are people too. You're only human. You've got like maybe a 30 or 40 minute window of time where you can present things. And if you just can't make everyone in the group happy, that's fine. If you just, a lot of people are also just going to be happy if you're just friendly and smiling. And if they're just out there, if it's an outdoors event, you know, they can still enjoy the walk. They can still enjoy the scenery, even if maybe the actual presentation sometimes doesn't really click with them so much. So it's not necessarily a catastrophe. And the more you panic, the worse your presentation will be overall. So try to be laid back. I think, again, it comes back to being comfortable with your own role. And that will also make you a good presenter. And yes, the audience really are your allies. Your audience is your mirror. So if you're friendly and genuine and interested, so will they be. Generally speaking, this might not apply to teenagers. They're a bit of a different species. But what does apply to almost all groups, I find, is that if you share responsibility and kind of say it out loud, that this is a joint event, let's all together make this a cool event. We're all here to enjoy ourselves, and your participation will make this special. That's something that I've done with teenagers who were kind of like, oh, I'm not in the mood to do this, whatever, that is all crap. And then kind of pointing out that, well, we are going to be here for the next 2 hours. And if you're going to have this attitude, you're just going to have like a really boring time. But if you put something of yourself into it, it could actually be cool. So that shared responsibility, again, you're kind of like flattening the hierarchy. You're not putting yourself there and thinking you have the responsibility for this entire event and you're the leader and you have to be like the big clown that entertains everyone now for this entire time. But you're really like pushing, like bringing it on a level so that you're interacting on one level and that everyone realizes we're all in this together, rather than we're in this in the really like hierarchical structure where the audience just kind of lets themselves be entertained and the speaker is the one who has to do all the work. And just this awareness of that everyone brings something to the table. Every group member is important. Kids see things that grown-ups don't see simply because they're closer to the ground. You can use that within the group dynamic. Old people have a mountain of stories from their lives that they can share. So everyone just brings something to the table and makes the experience more rich. And lastly, all of that, what I've said so far, relates in some way or other to this technique of active listening, which is a technique that's employed a lot in psychology, but also in other fields. What is active listening? Why is it so important? The main thing with active listening is that it turns an act that's often perceived as passive, the act of listening, into an active act. It involves observing nonverbal behavior. It involves observing body language, paying attention to how people say things, not only to what they say. So it basically just is an exercise in focusing on person-to-person communication. It requires the listener to be very focused on the speaker. And that basically means that you're building down the hierarchy you would have between a classic sort of top-down presenter and someone who's receiving things. Because what you would actually be doing in an active listening situation is that you put yourself on the exact same level as the person that you're speaking to, rather than talking at them. You're actually talking with them. So you avoid these hierarchies. There are barriers for this type of listening, external distractions, because it's all about focusing on the person you're communicating with. So if it's noisy or if you're physically uncomfortable, for example, because it's really cold and windy, this all draws your focus away from the actual conversation. So that makes it harder. Internal distractions, and I think for a presenter, the main thing is going to be the focus, because what you really need to try to do in that moment when you're trying to get to know your audience is to be in that moment, to really just really be interested in your audience, not kind of go through the exercise like ticking the box, like, okay, now I asked all the right questions, but what you're actually doing in your head is that you're thinking ahead to your presentation, and you're running basically through your first couple of minutes of your talk. So you're not in that situation. You're not actually focusing on the person. And that's a very, very hard thing to do, to detach yourself from this whole situation that you will be holding this presentation in a couple of minutes, and really be in that moment where you're getting to know each other, and you're focusing on each other, and you're trying to really get a feel for the people you're dealing with. And the third barrier are what we went through with the first impressions, with just making assumptions about people because of the way they dress, because of their age, because of how they're behaving. And that can then block your ability to actually, because you then start acting upon your assumptions, and you're not actually receiving all the clues that you could be receiving if you were just open, like an open channel to the person you're communicating with. So it's a lot about focus and about keeping an open mind and trying to really not go with these assumptions that you're automatically having on first impressions. And that brings us pretty much to the end of the presentation. I'm going to open up the floor in a second for feedback and questions. The last thing I wanted to touch on is something that has to do with this kind of non-hierarchical way of communicating, and that's the 4 sides model, which basically says all messages have these 4 sides to them. There's the factual level, which contains things like data and facts. There's the self-revelation, the self-revealing level, where the speaker tells us something about themselves and their motives and values and emotions. This can be conscious, like turn yourself into a person, but it can also be subconscious, or just involuntarily revealing things by, for example, your body language or the way how you say things. Then there's the relationship layer, where the relationship between the speaker and the audience comes in, or the sender and the receiver comes in. This could be how you perceive the hierarchy between you as the presenter and the others as the audience. This could also be sort of the relationship depending on things like, do they perceive a large gap between them and yourself, or don't they perceive a large gap? So what's the relationship like? And then there's the appeal layer, which contains the actual advice, or what you want, what actually your learning goal basically is, what it is that you want to bring across to the audience, and what you want to achieve by giving them the factual information that you're giving them. And it's really important to be aware of these different levels that every message has, because in science communication, traditionally, the factual information bit of things is massively elevated. There's a huge emphasis on the factual information, but it's only 1/4 of the whole message, which means if we disregard the importance of the self-revelation and the relationship layer, and we're just thinking we're going to go straight from the factual information to the appeal, then we're not really realizing how communication works, because that's exactly why scientists then were so flabbergasted when they said, but the facts about climate change, we've been communicating them for like 20 years, how come, or 30 years, how come people have not acted upon them? But it's because not all levels of the message were being looked at and were being taken care of when designing that kind of communication. So it's important to just know factual information is important. It's 1/4 of the picture, but it's not all that is important. And that concludes the presentation. Thank you very much for attending. It was really great to see you all here.